continuation of a series of lessons that we're doing that's going to take us right up into Easter. And as I said the last time I taught, Mark condenses a lot of the action that goes on in the week leading up to Easter, and it's a good way to get a sense of how tensions are just ramping up and up and up between Jesus and the religious leaders and now the government leaders on the way to the cross. And as we're in this Easter time, we're thinking about the story of the Passion. One thing that's important to understand is that none of this is unfolding the way most people thought it was going to happen in those times. When people of Jesus' time read the prophets and thought about the coming of the Messiah, they had an image in their head about how this would happen. And the way it's playing out is nothing like what they imagined. When they thought about the coming of the king that would restore the throne of David and crush Israel's enemies, they imagined a conquering military force that would take Rome and by the point of the sword and shed the blood of those that were oppressing them and throw them off so that God's kingdom could be set up on earth. But instead of a kingdom formed by the point of a sword, Jesus is establishing a kingdom on a cross. Instead of shedding the blood of others, Jesus is shedding his blood for everyone else. It's a kingdom set up not by power and might, but by loving sacrifice. So I want you to keep in mind, as all this has happened, none of this is playing out the way anybody had expected it to, but it's the way God had planned it. You'll also see, I want you to think, not just in this lesson, but in the lessons to come, how closely everything that happens mirrors a coronation of a king. The soldiers, of course, at the cross put a crown on Jesus' head, but it's not one of gold and fine jewels, but it's a crown of thorns. They put a garment on his back, but it's not a kingly robe. It's a garment that they used to mock him. But even as they're trying to degrade and embarrass and discourage this Jesus movement, they're doing exactly the thing they think they're making fun of. They are coronating Jesus, not as king of an earthly kingdom, but as the kingdom of heaven that he'd been preaching about since he had arrived on the scene and started preaching. We're going to start in verse 1. It says, "And straightway in the morning the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and scribes and the whole council, and bound Jesus and carried him away and delivered him to Pilate." In our last lesson, we learned how Jesus was in the garden with his disciples. He was praying. He was seeking God's guidance. And then this legion of Roman soldiers arrived to arrest him. And now they've arrested him and carried him off to the chief priests. They've gotten a plan together. They've decided what they're going to say to Pilate when they get there. And now they have arrived at Pilate's hall. I want you to know a few things about this man, Pontius Pilate. Pilate is a governor. He's a Gentile. He's not a Jewish person. He's Caesar's representative here in the backwoods of Judea. The Roman Empire that controlled Israel at this time was centered obviously in Rome. That's where Caesar sat. But Pilate was Caesar's authority. He was Caesar's representative here in Jerusalem. And as such, Pontius Pilate carries with him the full weight of Rome's authority. He's a civil authority. He's a judge. He's a military leader. If things go bad in this part of the world, Pontius Pilate is Caesar's man. He's in charge. This is the highest government authority that you could appeal to in this part of the world at this time. Pilate is the government right here. So Jesus, having Jesus appear before him is one of the most poignant events in the whole Easter story. Because like I said, Jesus was on a collision course from the very beginning of his ministry with the powers of this world. First, he ran up against the religious authorities. Now he's running up against the government and military authorities. And some people, as I said, had expected Jesus to eventually reach this spot where he's standing this morning. They had eventually expected him as the Messiah to enter into Pilate's hall, but they expected him to arrive with a rebel army with a sword in hand, that he would throw down Pilate and take that throne for himself. But instead, Jesus finally appears. You can read throughout the Gospels, time and time again, they take Jesus and they want to install him as king, and he avoids it at every time. Now Jesus has finally stepped into the realm of worldly authority, but not as a rebel leader, not as a conquering king, but as a bound prisoner at the mercy of the state. It's a complete inversion of what people expected. And instead of throwing Pilate down, Jesus is now interrogated by this representative of Caesar. Pilate asked him, read in verse 2, Pilate asked him, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" And he answering said unto him, "Thou sayest it." And the chief priests accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. Jesus answered nothing. And Pilate asked him again, saying, "Answerest thou nothing? Behold, how many things they witness against thee." But Jesus yet answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. Mark presents us with an abbreviated version of this encounter. You don't have to flip over, but if you were to go to John chapter 18, John, being a gospel writer, fills in some of the gaps that Mark leaves out here. John tells us that Pilate entered into the judgment hall, and he called Jesus and said unto him, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answered, "Sayest thou this thing of thyself, or did others tell it thee of me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Thine own nation and the chief priests have delivered thee unto me. What hast thou done?" And Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then would my servants fight, that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now is my kingdom not from hence." Pilate therefore said unto him, "Art thou a king then?" And Jesus said, "Thou sayest that I am a king. To this end was I born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness unto the truth. Every one that is of the truth heareth my voice." And Pilate saith unto him, "What is truth?" Pilate says, "What is truth?" as he looks into the eyes of the one who said, "I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life." But you need to know something else about Pilate. Pilate is a coward. History outside the Bible tells us that when Pilate first took this job, he had Roman standards brought into Jerusalem. The standards were these carved figures that the armies would carry before their legions as they went into battle. And they represented different Roman gods, and they represented different attributes of the Roman army, strength and unity and all this stuff. And it was a common practice. It was a visual symbol of who was calling the shots in your town now. But the locals threw a fit. And they considered that these standards that Pilate had brought in were graven images, that they were idols, and they raised such a ruckus that Pilate had them removed. He gave in. He showed his hand. He showed that he could be swayed by the opinion of the people. And in attempting to keep the peace, he ultimately undermines his authority, and he's about to do it again. And Pilate, to be somebody without a backbone, had been put in charge of a very tumultuous area of the world. Because you can even read in the Bible, they openly discuss in the book of Acts that there had been several messianic Christ movements leading up to Jesus' time. There had been rebels who had arrived and said, "I am the one God promised. I am the one that will deliver Israel." And they raise up and they gain armies, and then ultimately Rome has to smash them down, and then their movements are scattered. Jesus is just a long line, one member of a long line at this point of these people who they think is going to throw off Rome. Jesus, of course, being much different than all those that came before. But Pilate is left to tend what is essentially a pot that is about to boil over. And for somebody that doesn't have much of a backbone, that's not a good job to be in. So Pilate here is standing in front of this group of people, and he's trying to have his cake and eat it too. He wants to deliver justice, but he also wants to keep the peace with the people. So in verse 6, now at that feast he released unto them one prisoner, whomsoever they desired. And there was one named Barabbas, which lay bound with them that made insurrection with him, who had committed murder in the insurrection. And the multitude, crying aloud, began to desire him to do as he had done unto them. And Pilate answered, saying, Will ye that I release unto you the king of the Jews? For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him for envy. But the chief priests moved the people that he should rather release Barabbas unto them. Pilate believes he has found a loophole. Pilate has examined Jesus and determined that Jesus has not done anything wrong. And to deliver justice would be to release Jesus. But he also doesn't want to upset the authorities that have brought Jesus to Pilate. He doesn't want this to boil over into some revolution and potentially cost him his job. So he's like, I know what I'll do. Every year I release a prisoner to him, and this is a perfect out for me. Surely he had heard about all the words of Jesus. Surely Pilate had heard by this point about just days earlier how Jesus had come riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, and people had cried, Hosanna! Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. And they'd torn down palm branches from the trees and taken the coats off of their backs and laid it in the streets, so even the hooves of the colt that he rode on wouldn't have to touch the ground. Surely Pilate had heard, and he knew Jesus was popular with the people. So here's my loophole. I don't want to upset the chief priests, and I can't with good conscience convict Jesus because he's done nothing wrong. Jesus is popular with the people. What I'll do is I'll say, well, I'll tell you what, we'll just do what we always do. We'll let somebody loose. And who do you want? And Pilate, I know, he just expected him to say, well, yeah, give us Jesus. But the chief priests have been working on the crowd, and they've been whipping up the crowd. Isn't it interesting how much easier it is to change people's opinions when we're all in a group versus when we're one-on-one? You can get a crowd to do just about anything. So he whips them up, and no, they say, give us Barabbas instead. I want to tell you something about Barabbas. Some of the earliest surviving manuscripts that we have in history of the Gospel of Matthew doesn't just call him Barabbas. This is interesting. Some of those early manuscripts call him Jesus Barabbas. Now that's interesting. Jesus was a really common name at this time. And while we don't exactly know the history, it could be, it could not be. Isn't it interesting that there's a potential that this man's name was Jesus Barabbas? Barabbas would be his last name. Bar means son of. Abbas means of the Father. So this insurrectionist's name would have been Jesus, son of the Father. Again, it's a complete inversion. We're setting him up as the complete opposite of our Jesus, Jesus, the Son of God. And here, Barabbas, so often we refer to him as a murderer, but pay attention to the specific language that Mark is using. He's not just a murderer. Barabbas is an insurrectionist. Do you know what that means? Barabbas did the exact thing that the chief priests are accusing Jesus falsely of. They're lying on Jesus and saying that he's trying to start a rebellion against Rome. But Barabbas actually did it. Barabbas, we don't have a record of what happened, but evidently at some point, he and some of his buddies had gotten together a little army and tried to throw off Pilate and his rule. And he's called a murderer. So in the course of doing this, he has evidently shed some blood, likely of Roman soldiers or Roman government authorities as part of this movement. Barabbas is guilty of the exact thing that they are lying and trying to say Jesus is doing. And yet, the chief priests say, no, give us Barabbas. And Mark also tells us that Barabbas is he's laying bound with them that had made insurrection with him. Barabbas has already been arrested, tried, and convicted. There was only one fate for somebody who was arrested, tried, and convicted of an insurrection. Barabbas was headed to a cross. Yeah. A crucifixion was the lowest form of capital punishment that the Roman government could exercise. It was an embarrassing, it was a humiliating, it was an excruciating, it was a painful death. It was reserved for the lowest of the low of society. And they punished insurrectionists because the idea of a crucifixion was that you died slowly in public view. This is what happens to those who dare stand up against Caesar. That was the fate that Barabbas was headed for. We don't know how long he had been sitting in prison. We don't know how long ago this all had happened. But Barabbas was sitting in that jail cell knowing his day was coming. As I said, there was also this tradition, though, that a prisoner would be released. And it totally blows up in Pilate's face. It totally blows up. The loophole that he thought he had found doesn't work at all. They say, release Barabbas unto us. Verse 12, Pilate answered and said again unto them, what then? What will ye then that I shall do with him whom ye call the King of the Jews? And they cried, the same people who a week ago, not even a week ago, had cried, Hosanna, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. The same people cried out again, crucify him. And Pilate said unto them, why? What evil hath he done? And they cried out more exceedingly, crucify him. And so Pilate, willing to content the people, released Barabbas unto them and delivered Jesus when he had scourged him to be crucified. The actual insurrectionist, the actual rebel, the murderer is set free while the preacher who had gone all around the country said, listen, you've heard it said that you should love those who love you and do evil to those who do evil to you. But I say unto you that you should love your enemies. And if somebody should strike you on one cheek, I want you to turn and offer them the other. If they conscript you to go 1 mile, go 2. If they sue you and take your coat, give them your shirt. The one who had preached nothing but peace and forgiveness and love is sentenced to die the death of a rebel. But I want you to understand that this is always the decision that humankind makes. When given the choice of how we want to shape the world, we choose the way of Barabbas. When we want to make a difference in the world, we think we have to do it by force. We think we have to do it by violence. The way of Jesus is totally different, and because of our human nature, is completely offensive to us. It's why Paul says the cross is a stumbling block. It's foolishness to the world. Because the way of Jesus is the opposite. It's an inversion of everything we think we know about power. Because the way of Jesus gains authority not through might, but by self-giving love. It gains authority not at the tip of a sword, but upon a cross of self-giving sacrifice. It influences the world not through force, but through servitude. Jesus said, I haven't come that you should serve me, but that I should serve you, and you're going to serve each other. It's completely opposite from the way we want to do things. And time again throughout history here in first century Judea, and read any history book, mankind again and again chooses the way of Barabbas. But that is exactly the reason Jesus had to come. Jesus is a complete inversion. This is turning out not the way people would have expected. But it's also the way it had to be. Because the way of Jesus forces us to give up what is safe, the power that we can hold in our own hands, and surrendering it with open hands to God. Not my will, but thine be done. So the murderer goes free, while the healer, the restorer, the miracle worker, The one who would open blinded eyes, who would raise the dead, who would unstop deaf ears while he goes to a rebel's cross. What a sick turn of events. But I want to draw your attention to something else. We've discussed in previous lessons how the events surrounding Jesus' crucifixion so closely mirror the observance of Passover. When the people of God remember how God had delivered them out of Egypt, and they commemorate that occasion with the killing, the sacrifice, and the consumption of a spotless lamb. And the gospel writers present Jesus as that final spotless lamb. But I think in this prisoner release, God is pointing us toward another ritual that you can read about in the book of Leviticus called the Day of Atonement. This was the day when the high priest would enter into an area of the temple that was reserved only for him, that he could only enter one time a year, called the holiest of holies, where the very Spirit of God dwelled. And that was the day when the priest would take a sacrifice for the sins of the people, all the sins that the people had committed over the last year. And he would plead to God that those sins would be washed away. But before that sacrifice could happen, outside the temple door, that chief priest, that high priest, would be presented with two offerings, two goats. One would go before the altar of God and serve as a sacrifice. The other would be set free. God is pointing us toward the Day of Atonement. Barabbas is the scapegoat. Jesus is the atoning sacrifice. Jesus is being presented once and forever for the atonement of mankind's sins. Now, before I sit down, let's think about one more thing. Let's consider all of this from Barabbas' point of view. Wherever Barabbas was, wherever he was held, likely he was not close enough to Pilate's hall to hear everything that had been happening. But there was such a throng gathered, maybe the sound waves carried through the stone streets of Jerusalem, carried those messages into his prison cell, that dark, dirty prison cell where he had spent days, weeks, months, who knows. Early on Friday morning, he hears something. Maybe Barabbas knows that they had been building crosses on the outside of town. Barabbas, knowing what his conviction was, understood that one of them was meant for him.
Yep.
He's not close enough to hear Pilate plead with the crowd, Jesus is innocent. What would you have me do? I release a prisoner every year. Pilate was one voice. He couldn't hear that. But what Barabbas no doubt heard was a giant crowd of bloodthirsty people scream, "Give us Barabbas!" He wasn't close enough to hear Pilate plead with him. But I find no fault in this man. All he likely heard was that crowd scream, "Give us Barabbas!" He wasn't close enough to hear Pilate say, "Well, what do you want me to do with Jesus?" All Barabbas likely heard was the crowd say, "Crucify him." "What evil has he done?" Pilate said. Barabbas wouldn't have heard it. All he would have heard was that bloodthirsty throng scream, "Crucify him. Give us Barabbas. Give us Barabbas. Crucify him. Crucify him." And he no doubt heard that crowd coming down the street, getting closer and closer, and the jeers and the insults and the curses. "Give us Barabbas. What are we going to do with Jesus? Crucify him." But Barabbas wouldn't have heard all that conversation, would he? They draw closer and closer to the prison where he'd been held, and then it sounds in his ears like maybe they're continuing to move down the street. What in the world happened? The next thing Barabbas would have seen was a cell door swinging open. A Roman soldier with keys in his hand. What in the world's happening? I'm not ready. I need to make peace with my God. The Roman soldier lifts him up. Next thing Barabbas knows, for the first time in months, he's blinking into the daylight. There's not a crowd around. There's no shackles on his hands and feet. Maybe he turns around and looks at that Roman soldier and says, "What is happening?" Maybe the Roman soldier says, "You're free." He said, "What do you mean I'm free?" Maybe the Roman soldier said, "A man named Jesus just took your place." Barabbas is the first to be set free because of Jesus' crucifixion. The world's system of hate and violence, power by the point of the sword, survival of the strongest, had led Barabbas to bondage and a death sentence. Doing things the world's way had guaranteed an end to his life. But the way of Jesus, the way of sacrifice, the way of love, the way of the suffering servant, set Barabbas free and continues to set us free if we choose the way of Jesus and not the way of Barabbas. Thank you for your attention.
Amen.